Okay, so we'll be starting our technical discussion for today, week number 8 and the first lecture of this week. So the topic for today is friend functions and friend classes, right? We had seen some glimpses of the general idea of what are friend functions in the previous topic, that was operator overloading, right? But today we'll see it more formally and in more detail, right? And then it will also reinforce the discussion that we have had on this topic when we were looking at operator overloading, right? So let's see in detail what it is and how it works. Okay, so let me just open up the board. Yeah, so basically we'll be discussing friend functions and classes. So first I'll be talking about friend function, and maybe later on we can move to friend classes. Okay, so let's start with friend functions. Okay, so you see previously we have been saying that this is a class has some data, right, and class has some functions. Okay, and from outside the class, okay, you can only access something that is public, right? For example, you create an object of some class, say point p, and then p dot, you can write anything that is public, right? So mostly functions are public, so after this dot you can call any function, right? But if there is some data like xy which is private, so we say that you cannot directly access data with dot operator from outside the class, right? And outside the class can be some other class, outside the class can be main, or outside the class can be some other function, right? It can be any standalone global function. So when we talk about the idea of friend functions, right, so they are special in a sense that we grant them a privilege. And what is that privilege? That privilege is that we allow them to access the private data of a class using dot operator. Means if a function is a friend of a class, then these will become legal statements. Okay. As we also discussed last time, that this is actually violation of the basic principles of object-oriented programming, that normally we say that data should not be accessible outside the class, right? That's why we make it public. So that's why you see friend functions are not very commonly used, right? But in some situations they can be helpful, just like we saw in case of operator overloading, where every time instead of calling the get and set methods, right, you can directly use the data with the dot operator if you trust that function, right? So otherwise we agree that friend functions should not be very frequently used. You should only use them if there is a requirement, or maybe you are doing operator overloading, but do not use them very frequently. Okay, so let's discuss this in detail with a concrete example. Okay, so like always, I'll just make a class, then we'll discuss how we can use the concept of friend function, right? So let me just quickly write the data of this class, right, which we always do. So we have point class, and we have two data members, x and y. And similarly, you can have its constructor and all other methods, right? Okay, now suppose in the main we make an object of this class, say point p, which is like 2 3. Okay, and now we want to make a function, right? Suppose this is p, which is 2 3. This is x and y. Okay, now we want to make a function, just assume, which can add the x and y coordinates together, right? So we want to make a function which will add 2 and 3 and give us 5. Okay, this is just a hypothetical example only for discussion purposes. But this function is not a member function. We are making it a global standalone function, right? Means it is not a member of a class. Okay, so let me make this function in this part, right? This is not a part of the class. This is outside the class. Okay, so we say int, because when you add x and y, you get an integer. We give a name to the function. I call it add x and y. Okay, and we pass it a point object, say point p or whatever you want to call it. Okay, now you see, if we want to do this, what do we have? We can write return p dot get x. Why I'm calling the function get x? Because x is private, so I cannot write p dot x, right? Plus p dot get y. And I am assuming that you have both of these functions in the class. Okay, you have a function get x in which you have return x. Similarly, you have a function get y which says return y. Okay, so this is the normal way of doing it, that okay, if we want to achieve this, we can do it, and then in the main you can call this function like add xy. You can pass it p, and whatever value it gives you, you can actually store it in an integer and display it. Sorry. But now what we want to do is we say, okay, I don't want to call these get functions, right? I want, rather than this statement, I want to write like this, say return p dot x plus p dot y. Okay, so instead of calling these get functions, we say, okay, let's allow this function to directly access the private data of the class. Okay, and why we are doing it? Because we don't want to call the get function, right? In this case, we only have to call get function, but there can be a requirement where we also have to repeatedly call the set function, right? So in order to avoid that, we say, okay, why not grant this function a special privilege? Why not make this function special? And how do we do that? We can make this function a friend of class point. Okay, and I told you last time how to do that. You simply copy the prototype of this function, which is this, and you put it in the class, and you add the keyword friend. Okay, so let me write it so that you can correlate it with the discussion. So you use the keyword friend. Friend is a keyword, right? And after that you write this prototype. Okay, so what do I write? Int add xy, and it is accepting a point as an object, right? If you want, you can write variable name. If you don't want, there is no need, because in prototype we don't need to give the variable, right? Now what is this statement doing now? Now you see, when you add this statement to the class, it is telling your program that the function add xy is a friend of this class, and now this function can access the private data of the class using dot operator, right? Of course, public was previously being accessed. If something is public, it is already accessible, right? So when you make a friend, you are also letting the function access the private data with dot operator. So now this will become a legal statement. Okay, now since this function is a friend of this class, so now this particular function can directly access the private data, right? So if you have multiple functions in your program, and of course to one or two of them you want to make a friend of the class, then for each of them you will need to add the prototype of that function within the class and use the keyword friend. Okay, now there are a few important things before we make this program on the compiler and run it. You see, when you are writing this prototype in the class, it is not it does not become a member of the class, right? So it does not matter whether you write this thing in the public or private, right? It does not matter. Why it does not matter? Because this function add xy, it is not a member of a class. And when we are talking about private and public, they are applicable only to the members of the class, that what you can access from outside, what you cannot access, right? So even if you write it in private or you write it in public, it does not make any difference. Why? Because this is not a member function. Another important point is that you see who is making the decision that the function will be friend, right? You see, it is the class. So for example, if there is a function add xy, I am writing this function. I cannot forcefully make it a friend of class point. The person who is writing class point, he has the decision that which functions he or she wants to make friend, right? Because the person who is writing the point class, he will be writing this. So if that person who is writing the point class, they trust this function, only then they will make this function a friend of this class, right? So a very important, you can say, concept related to this is that friendship is granted by the class. It cannot be taken, right? When I say it cannot be taken, it means this function cannot decide, or it cannot take the decision that I will be a friend of point class. Who is taking the decision? The class. Okay, and now it makes sense because you see the private data is within the class. So it should be the class who should take the decision which function can access private data and which functions cannot access data. It makes sense, right? So that's why when you read some books or literature, you will frequently see this statement that friendship is granted by the class, it cannot be taken by the function. And this is the way it should be, right? So I think we can now make this program, okay, and try to run this, and let's see what output we get. Okay, so let me go to the compiler, share it with you. We already have the class there. Okay, so I'll just be adding the function to this class. Okay, and we'll make that function a friend of the class. Okay, so you can see your screen, the class is already there from the very beginning. So let's add a function here. Okay, so I'll be making a function int add xy, and I'm passing it a point p. Okay, so what do we want? We want to add x and y coordinates together. We'll get an integer, we want to return that. Okay, so as I told you, presently you can do p dot get x plus p dot get y, and it should work perfectly fine. Okay, now you can, from the main, you can call this function and you can convince yourself that it is working. Okay, so let's make a point p which is 4 3. Okay, and then we can write p dot print point just to see, and then we write cout adding x and y. What do we get? And we can actually call that function add xy, and we pass it p. Okay, now you see, since it is a global function, so we are calling it without an object, add xy, right? Because it is not a member function. When it is a member function, you call it with p dot, right? So presently, this program is without any friend function, right? This is the normal way of doing things. We have a global function which is adding x and y coordinates and giving you the answer. Okay, so let's first run it and see the output so that we can extend the same program to friend functions. Okay, so let me show you the output screen. Now you see the point was 4 3. When we add x and y together, we get 7. So you see 7 printed on the screen, right? And this is what we expected. Okay, now let's do the same thing, but this time instead of calling these get methods, what do I want? I'll just comment it. Okay, and I want to be able to write return p dot x plus p dot y. Okay, now you see, if I write it, it is giving me an error, right? And what is the error? You can guess. It will say x and y are inaccessible, right? It is saying that member is inaccessible. Why it is inaccessible? Because x and y are private, and I am trying to access them from a function which is outside the class, right? So this is not allowed. Now, in order to make this a legal statement, what do? I copy this function declaration, Control C. I go to the class, and anywhere in the class, right? Anywhere. You can paste it in private or public. It does not make any difference. So I'm pasting it here. You paste it. Okay. The prototype of this function, and you add the keyword friend. Okay. So with this, now we are telling, this class is telling that this function add xy is a friend of this class. Now you see, this, the error which was there, it is gone now. Now this is a legal statement. Now we can write p dot x, p dot y. Why we can write it? Because we have defined this function as a friend of a class, and now it is allowed to access the private data of this class. So let me run this program and see if we are getting the same output. Let's see the output screen. Okay, I hope you can see the output screen where we again have exactly the same output. 4 and 3 are added, we are getting 7. But this time the difference is that we are not calling the get methods, we are not calling any function, we are directly accessing the private data of the class using dot, because this function was a friend, right? So this actually is the key part, that this function, which is not member of class, still it is able to access data. Why? Because in the class we have said that this function is a friend of this class. Okay, and as I told you, this is very important, that who is taking the decision of making friend? The class is taking the decision, right? Because you are writing it within the class. So the person who is writing the point class, he has the authority to decide that which functions should be friend functions, right? If a function is trustworthy, it can be given the status of a friend function, so that you don't have to call get and set functions repeatedly. Okay, now let's do another example, right? But a slightly different example. And this time we'll be making two classes, right? And we'll see that there is a function which needs to access the private data of both the classes. Okay, so this is just a scenario we have created so that we can actually discuss how it works, right? Maybe practically you may not need such a situation, but just for discussion purposes, we have created this scenario that there are two different classes and a function needs to access private data of both those classes, right? Or two or more classes. So let's make two classes, but very simple one, right? Without much data. So I'm calling it class A, and in this I have one data member which I'm calling data. That's it. And public, I will just make the constructor, nothing else. Okay. So this is the constructor of the class. It says int d, and data gets the value d, and that's it. Okay, so this is class A. Now, just like that, exactly like that, we make another class which is class B. So in class B, again, we take some data. I'm again calling it data. You can call it anything else. So in the public, again, I will just make the constructor of this class. So I write data gets the value d, and that's it. Okay, now let's see what do we want to do. Okay, suppose in the main I create an object of class A, which is 2, and B, which is 4. Okay, so it is like this is your object A, this is your object B. They both have integer, we are calling it data, so it has 2, it has 4. Okay, now we want to make a function which can add the data of B and A together, right? It means we want 4 plus 2 to be 6. In the previous example, we did something similar, right? But we did it for the point class, and X and Y that we were adding, they were members of the same class, right? So this is similar, but still slightly different scenario where we want to make a global function, standalone function, which needs to access the private data of two different classes, add them together and give you back the answer, right? So this is what we want to do. So let's try to make that function, and just I'll first be making that without friend functions, and then we'll extend the idea to friend functions. Okay, so if we have to make a function, then since we are adding two integers, so answer would be integer, right? Let's call it add AB, because we are adding A and B. Okay, so what it will accept as an argument, it is accepting an object of class A and an object of class B, right? Because in order to access the data, we need the object. So if we are doing this without friend functions, then you know how will we do? We'll write A dot get data. I'm assuming there's a function get data here, plus b dot get data. Again, I'm assuming you have a function get data in this class, right? So you see, this should work perfectly fine. But now we want to do the same thing. Rather than using these functions, we want to directly access the private data. Okay, so what we want to achieve, we want to achieve this, that I should be able to write a dot data plus b dot data. Presently, this is not allowed. Okay. Now, in order to allow this, what do we need to do? We need to make this function a friend of class A as well as friend of class B. Why? Because this function needs to access the private data of A as well as B, right? You see, let me just highlight it. We are accessing private data, A dot data. A is an object of class A. So for this, it must be a friend of A. And for this, because we are accessing private data of class B, it must be a friend of B. Okay, now how to do that? In each of the classes, you will add the prototype of this function with the keyword friend. So this will become a friend of both the classes. Okay, so let me try to do that so that we can discuss. Okay, let's do it. Okay, so I'll just write friend and int add AB. Okay, I'm running out of space, so maybe I'll just write compact form. Yeah, just like that. And now when you do this, this function is now a friend of class A. So this first part is done. Okay, but the second part still remains to be done. So this function should also be just like A, this should also be a friend of class B. So you will write this statement, friend int add AB and A comma B. Okay, so now this is also a legal statement. So you see, this is basically a function which needed to access the private data of two different classes. So we have to make it a friend of both the classes. Now this function is a friend of class A and also a friend of class B. So it can access the private data of both the classes. But there's a small point that we need to discuss before we can make this program, which might be something new for you. But let's discuss it so that in the future, if such a situation arises, you are familiar with that. Okay, now you see, when we are writing this statement, friend uh, int add a b a comma b, right? So you see, if you have a program, suppose in a single file, this is your file. Okay, first you have this class A, then you have class B, and then you have main and so on. Okay, even if they are in separate files, the same is true. Okay, now what is happening, that here you are using B, right? So it means you are using B in class A, but B is defined afterwards, right? When you are using B, B is not defined as yet. First you define class A, then B. So if you are writing this, you are writing B here, your program will complain what is B. It will say B is undefined. Just like if you make a function and you don't give the declaration of the function, and you call it from the main, the program will complain that the function is undefined, right? That is why you give the declaration of the function first, then you write main, and in the main you call the function, and then you have function definition. So it's more or less a similar situation, that we are using B here, but B is defined after A. Okay. Now, if you swap the order of A and B, means if I first have class B and then A, you see, then the same problem will be class A, because now you are using A, which is not defined yet. Okay, so this is the problem. So just swapping the order will not work, because in this case, B is causing problem. If I first make class B, then A will be causing problem. So a solution to this is that just like you have function declaration, you have something which is called class declaration, right? And what is that? That before this, you simply just write class B semicolon. Now, what is this? This is class declaration. And why we are doing this? This is simply telling your program, just like a function declaration or a function prototype, that there is a class B which is defined later in the program. Okay, and here it is defined. So this is class definition. So you see, just like you do function declaration, so that when you are calling the function from the main, the program does not complain. Exactly in the same way, we have this class declaration, which is telling your program that there is a class B which you have defined later in the program. If you don't do this, then what will happen? That you will use B here, so it will say, what is B? I don't know what is B, because B you have defined later in the program. Okay, so this maybe this was a slightly new concept, but it's fairly simple. You just write the keyword class and name of the class, which is class declaration. And here where you are giving the complete data of the class, the functions of the class, this is actually class definition. Okay, so I think we can write the same program. Okay, and then maybe we can discuss. So let me just make the same program so that we can discuss it if we have some problems. Okay, so I'll quickly make the two classes. Let's call it class A, and I have private int data, and I make a constructor, so I can write A data gets the value. Okay, let's call it D rather than A, and that's it. Okay, so this is class A. Then you write class B int data, and you have a constructor in this class as well. So I write data gets the value D. Okay, so now you have both of these classes. Okay, and now we'll make the function. So I'm making the function int add AB. So it is having an object of class A and an object of class B. And what do we want? We want A dot data plus B dot data to be a legal statement. Presently, it is giving me an error. Why? Because this function cannot access the private data of the class. Now I will simply copy the prototype of this function. Okay, and I'll put it in both the classes. Why both the classes? Because this function needs to access private data of both the classes. Okay, and same I do for class A. And as I told you that since we are using B here, so what I need to do, I need to give class declaration. I will just write class B semicolon. So this is class declaration. Okay, I'll explain again why we were using this. So I think yes, now you can see the complete screen. So you see, this was the function which needed to access private data of both A and B. So here we are making it a friend of class B. Here we make it a friend of class A. And since I'm using B here, okay, and B is defined later. So that's why we have this statement class B semicolon, which is called class declaration. Just like function declaration, you are telling your program that there's a class B which is defined later in the program. And now this function can access the private data of both the classes. You can do whatever you want to do within this function. Okay, this was just for illustration that we said we are adding the data members of two classes. Of course, for a practical application, you can do anything that is required by the program. So let me just summarize it. So basically, so far what we have done, we have a class which has data and functions, okay, and we have some standalone function, okay, and what we are doing that if this was public and this was private, okay, so what was happening that previously public was already accessible, private was not accessible. Now when we make this function a friend of this class, and how do we do that? We simply write its prototype with the keyword friend. So now this function will be able to access the private data of this class. Whatever object you have, you can write object dot x, where x is some private data, and it will be granted access, right? So this was, you can say, a slightly different example, still on the same concept, right? Again, I'm repeating that the most important part is that class is taking the decision that which function should be friend, right? A function cannot itself become friend of a class. Who is deciding? Class is deciding, because within the class you are writing the keyword friend followed by the prototype of the function which you want to make friend, right? So this is very, very important. That's why I'm repeating it time and again, that class takes the decision that which functions can be friend function, right?